Book TV's College Series.
Well, Book TV is on location at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where we're interviewing some professors who are also authors. Joining us now is Charles Kurzman. His most recent book is The Missing Martyrs: Why There Are So Few Muslim Terrorists. Professor Kurzman, you write in your book, the bad news for Americans is this: Islamist terrorists really are out to get you. Then you go on to say that the good news for Americans is this: there aren't very many of them.
It seems counterintuitive, I think, because terrorism is so often in the news, and we see horrible attacks around the world, and even here in the United States. Of course, on September 11th, 2001, the worst in memory. But then more recently as well, the Boston Marathon bombings last year, and arrests here and there, and plots being disrupted. But if you step back for a second and think, what is the overall picture, the threat assessment for public safety in the United States and around the world? There isn't nearly as much terrorism as we were afraid there might be. In the weeks and the months after 9/11, experts were telling us to expect the new normal, that we were going to get attacks like this on a regular basis. And we haven't. And in fact, even though we don't want to dismiss this threat, I want to put it in perspective, and the book tries to do that. It tries to say, how come we haven't seen more, and what is the scale of the threat to public safety from terrorism versus other sorts of threats?
Put some numbers.
Sure.
This. How many terrorists are there in the world?
I've tried to estimate that based on declassified documents and all sorts of reports by security professionals. And it appears that there are fewer than 100,000 terrorists. Now that sounds like a huge number, 100,000 people. That's a swarm of people out to get us. But almost all of those are folks who are focused on their own country. What they want to do is make a revolution in their own country, far away from here, in basically a handful of places where there's really active revolutionary Islamist movements. So the bulk of those, more than 90%, are no threat to Americans here in the United States. They're engaged in terrorism as a means, as what they see as an effective revolutionary strategy. But they're not going to be wandering over to the United States to attack Americans. So these are places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, some parts of the Sahel region of Western Africa, and a handful of other places where the bulk of these revolutionary Islamists using terrorist methods are located. If we want to turn to the United States, how many are there in the United States? Well, after 9/11, the FBI director went to Congress and said he suspected that there were several hundred Al-Qaeda related militants in the United States. And he was concerned that the FBI needed to find those people before they create havoc here in the United States and do something again on the order of an attack of a scale of 9/11. There hasn't been anything nearly like that. We have found a handful of Al-Qaeda related terrorists in the United States, really about a dozen. And most of them were not very effective. They were the hangers-on and the stringers who were really not ready for the big leagues. We know this because they opened up very easily, in most cases, to FBI informants. And almost every case of a terrorist plot in the United States related to Islamic revolutionaries abroad, if there were two or more people in the room, one of them was an FBI informant. Now, we've been very fortunate that that's the case. There have been attacks. There have been, obviously, like the Boston Marathon bombing, there have been cases where militants have gotten a hold of weapons, they've gotten a hold of explosives, and they've actually detonated them. And there have been fatalities and there have been horrible injuries, and I don't mean to minimize that. Let's think, though, in terms of the threat to public safety here in the United States. There have been 37 deaths that we can potentially attribute to Islamic terrorism in the United States since 9/11. Let's add to that the 3,000 approximately on 9/11 itself. That's a horrible death toll. Over that same period, however, there have been more than 190,000 murders in the United States, and we have over 12,000 murders a year. So terrorism is not a leading cause of death. It is a minuscule portion of the murders that we see in the United States each year. Now, we want to get rid of it. I want to have, obviously, I'm not in favor of terrorism, and I don't mean to minimize it, but I do want to point out that in context, it is not a leading threat to public safety.
What about those terrorists that are overseas? Are they in any way a threat to the U.S.? Or should we be concerned about them in general?
Absolutely, in the way that we're concerned about all sorts of threats to public safety all over the world. There were, a virulent virus, or revolutionary movements of all sorts of threats, war, civil war, organized crime. There's a huge number of threats to public safety. Many of them in our globalized world affect Americans. Things spread very quickly now around the world. Terrorism is one portion of that, and let's take it seriously, but let's not pretend that that is our main threat overseas or here in the United States.
What about training camps? Are they still being set up in Pakistan, in Afghanistan?
Yes, we know from all sorts of declassified evidence, I don't have access to the classified stuff, that training camps exist. What's interesting is that since the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the size of those camps is tiny compared to what it was under the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. So at that time, they had hundreds or even thousands of people being trained, militants going through these camps at a time. Now the camps are very small. They're more and more isolated geographies. It's harder and harder to get there. They're way up in the mountains or out in the deserts and remote locations in West Africa or in Somalia. And the numbers going through those camps is much, much smaller. So the threat in that degree, from that perspective, has gone down by a factor of 10 or more since 9/11. And if we look at the amount of violence before and after 9/11, the amount of terrorism has actually been lower since 9/11 than it was in the years before 9/11, according to the Global Terrorism Database and other sources that try to track these things, excluding civil wars. So there's a handful of civil wars that are very bloody in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Pakistan. Those civil wars have generated a huge number of casualties. I mean, it's appalling, thousands of people a year. And that's where we see the bulk of terrorism fatalities these days. Outside of those civil wars, the numbers are considerably lower globally than they were before 9/11, fatalities from terrorism. We're actually living as a world in a much safer world than we did at any point in modern history. There are fewer interstate wars, wars between governments. There are fewer civil wars now than in previous decades. It's a remarkably safe place. Life expectancy is going up. We don't get that feeling from the news. And of course, there's tremendous misery going on. But in fact, the world is looking up these days. Not to relax our attention on things we ought to be improving and making a commitment to improving, from public health to political violence to all sorts of things. But I think we should take some sort of sense of pride and relaxation, perhaps, and turn down the volume on our anxieties when we look at how much we have actually accomplished in reducing violence in the world.
Professor Kurzman, the reduction in terrorism in the world, is it due to some of the measures that we took after 9/11?
I think that has to be factored in. In some cases, the heightened attention and scrutiny and the crackdown on groups that were previously allowed to operate more or less with impunity. Almost every government in the world is now against terrorism and is trying to actively suppress terrorist groups in their territory. That wasn't necessarily the case before 9/11. All sorts of police actions, more incarceration, harsher legal treatment of people convicted of terrorism-related crimes. That's probably played into it. At the same time, most of what's going on here is that Muslims and others aren't interested. There just aren't that many arrests. There isn't that much of a difference in the legal treatment to account for the change in patterns and terrorist activities. If you think about Islamic terrorists, these revolutionaries who have a global span like Al-Qaeda and its affiliates and allies, they think of themselves as having 1.5 billion constituents. Every Muslim in the world is what they're appealing to in their public documents and their public pronouncements. That's a lot of potential terrorists. But most of those folks have no interest whatsoever, either in what Al-Qaeda and these other groups are selling in an Islamic state, or in the means that they're proposing to get that goal, to reach that goal. That is violence, and indiscriminate violence at that, against civilians. They're just not interested. If even 1% of 1% of Muslims were open to that message, the message is out there on the internet, anybody can find it. The recipes and the tools for engaging in these acts of violence are out there, anybody can get them. If even a fraction, tiny fraction, of the world's billion, more than a billion Muslims were interested, we would see violence every day, everywhere. But we don't. We see it here, we see it there, here and there. There can be horrible events. If you live there, it's a terrible thing that day. And overall, the scope is really, appalling. These are murderers. These are mass murderers. Fortunately, most people aren't buying that message. They're not signing on. So yes, law enforcement has had an impact. Counterterrorism has probably had an impact. But the main heroes of this story are the folks saying, no, that's not for me. There are people living their ordinary lives. Those are Muslims who are neighbors. Those are Muslims who may live halfway across the world. I think they deserve some credit for just being human, just the way we give credit to everybody. Thank goodness we're not all violent maniacs.
How much of a focus of terrorists or other nations is the U.S. today, and is our support of Israel still a big factor?
How much is the U.S. a focus? We are the global hegemon. We are the world's most powerful country, and we have an opinion and often a military or diplomatic say in every major dispute around the world. So we're going to attract a disproportionate amount of attention from groups who are upset about the way things are in the world, and that is especially the case for Islamic militants who believe that we are at war with Islam, that is our overall goal is to destroy Islam. And that's their message that they're putting out all the time on their websites, on their bulletin boards, in their pronouncements, their videos on YouTube. And that's the message they're trying to say, is that the United States is out to get all Muslims and all of Islam. Most people just say, yeah, whatever. There's a fair proportion of Muslims and of non-Muslims around the world who believe there's some truth in that we are an imperialist power, that we're intervening in places we have no business being, and that we're hostile to all sorts of alternative political, religious, cultural beliefs and ways of life. But most of those folks are not about to pick up guns or bombs and do something violent in response. They have political opinions, and there is anti-Americanism out there, and a fair bit of it, according to surveys. There's a fair bit of it in France. There's a fair bit of it in a lot of countries that are not generating terrorism. I think we need to separate those political views, which people have a right to, according to our American ideals. You have a right to those political views, from violent acts that you do not have a right to engage in. Very small numbers engaging in violent acts. Let's not tar all the anti-Americans. I may disagree with them, I may agree with parts of what they say. Let's not tar all of them with the brush of violence. Now, you mentioned Israel and our support for Israel. That is a potential, an ongoing and recurrent irritant for many, many parts of the world, and not just Muslim communities that identify with the Muslim portion of the Palestinian movement. Let's remember that many Palestinians are Christian as well. That's a huge issue. It's a front page, headline, banner issue in many countries around the world. For Americans, it's sort of a sideshow. But it's a major irritant for many people around the world. What's interesting is you have here a case of probably the world's only case of perfectly overlapping duplicate nationalisms. Two movements that at their extremes claim the same territory for a different nation. So the Palestinian Hamas and other movements that claim all of Palestine as they see it, there is no Israel for them, and various Israeli settler movements that their maps and their emblems show there is no Palestine, and they claim all of Palestine for Israel. That is an unusual situation, and that is a very difficult thing to solve. I'm not sure that an American president, even if one really were to engage in it, and they don't seem to, they're on and off about it, could ever solve that. But we are heavily on one side, and we're seen as being heavily on one side of this conflict. And yes, that is a constant talking point for Islamic revolutionaries around the world, but also for all sorts of political movements as well that are not Islamic and not revolutionary and not engaged in terrorism. I don't see an easy way out of this. Politically, it is very difficult in the United States for us to change sides, even if the president or an administration wanted to. I think this is just the world as it is, and that we're going to be living with this for some time. On the other hand, I'm happy to be surprised and to be taken aback at some dramatic development that changes the situation. I've written a book on Iran, about the revolution in Iran, called The Unthinkable Revolution in Iran. That revolutions and major political changes in course, uprisings and rebellions, are inherently unpredictable. That they really can't tell, and they're unpredictable because the people making them didn't know they were going to succeed until they succeeded. Those kinds of changes happen constantly, and everybody says, how come we didn't see it coming? Because you can't. These things are literally unpredictable. We'll know them when they happen. So if something happens that changes the course either of the Israeli-Palestinian interaction or change in the course, some dramatic event occurring with Islamic revolutionary movements, I will come on and say I was wrong. I was wrong, I didn't see it coming, I didn't predict it, but then I'll say, but I was right, because these things are unpredictable.
Charles Kurzman, in The Missing Martyrs, you spend a bit of time critiquing Bernard Lewis. Who is he, and why do you critique him?
Bernard Lewis, for decades, was perhaps the leading Middle East specialist in the United States. An eminent figure, a professor at Princeton, author of many books, including bestsellers, as well as academic books on the Middle East. But he has this view of the Middle East as sort of an unchanging, eternal place where the views of people 500 years ago can explain what people think today. I don't see it that way. I think there's been a huge break, the break of modernity, where before, in the Middle Ages, up to about a century and a half ago, has very little to do with what people believe and how they act and the institutions they engage in today. The rise of the modern state totally has changed people's identities and their forms of action, their scope of action. The people now are engaged in national movements. They believe in their national identities. Not all of them, but a huge portion, and you didn't see that 2 centuries ago. Islam has come to mean something very different than what it meant 2 centuries ago for the vast majority of Muslims. It means for many of them a return to the sacred sources, not the traditions that their forefathers practiced. And so you see all sorts of Islamic authorities popping out of the woodwork. So you can have somebody who's a civil engineer like bin Laden claim to be an authority on Islam. He was not a trained Islamic scholar. He was a do-it-yourself scholar. And yet he was accepted by, as I said, a small portion, but unfortunately a dangerous portion of the Muslim community. It's the same popping up all over. New sorts of authorities, new sorts of Islams, new sorts of action. And that's why I think that a medievalist who tells us about what happened in 1400 cannot extrapolate to what's going to be happening in 2014 or in any given year in the modern era.
We're sitting here on the campus of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. You open The Missing Martyrs with a story about Mohammed Tahiri Azar. Who is that?
Yes, he was a student here at University of North Carolina. He graduated several years ago, and then was working at a local pizza place as a delivery person as he was becoming more and more enamored of Islamic terrorism, of a revolutionary upheaval. He was Muslim by background, although was not raised religious at all, and in fact was raised in a Shia Muslim household, whereas Al-Qaeda and other Islamic revolutionaries of that sort are Sunni Muslims and really dislike Shia Muslims and feel that they're not real Muslims. He didn't have any sense of that. He was not trained in any religious Islamic training, and so he was another do-it-yourself theologian. While he was delivering pizzas, he decided that he wanted to engage in an act of terrorism to support what he saw as this revolutionary movement against U.S. imperialism, the war against Islam. And so he went to a gun store near here that also has a firing range, and he tried out a number of handguns. And he really liked one model. And he said, I'll take it. And he was going to use that, he said, to go to a dining hall right here on campus at lunchtime, it was packed, and shoot up as many people as he could and kill as many people as he could. It's a dining hall I happen to go to on a regular basis with my students. It would have been a horrible, bloody tragedy. So they said at this gun store, well, you need, according to federal and North Carolina law, for a handgun, you got to get a permit. Got to go to your county sheriff, get the permit. He goes to the county sheriff. It says you need to have 2 character witnesses say that you are fit to have a handgun. He was such a loner by this point that he didn't even feel he could ask his roommates to sign for him, and he gave up on that plan. Now, he could have gone to any number of places online or a gun show and gotten one without a permit or illegally. Of course, there's tons of illegal guns. He gave up on that plan, and we're very lucky that he did. Instead, he rented a 4-wheel drive vehicle and drove onto campus, not a quarter mile from here, drove onto campus, drove past the English building, drove past this dining hall, and went to a center of campus called the Pit. It was lunchtime, it was a Friday, it was early March, just like this. But it was a beautiful day, unlike today. And there were all sorts of people, students milling around between classes, hanging out, having lunch. And he stops for a moment, according to students who saw him. And he gets to this central area, stops, and then guns the gas and drives as fast as he can, veering to hit people as they scatter to get out of the way. And he hit 9 people. And some of them went off the windshield, some went off the bumpers. One went under a tire, but fortunately he didn't kill anybody. We had some broken bones, but nobody was killed. We were fortunate that, again, his incompetence or whatever, a lack of foresight, he picked a location that's symbolically central as trying to damage us as a campus and as a nation. A university campus is a site you wouldn't expect a terrorist attack. But it's also a very short area, and he couldn't get that much speed going, and he had to stop and turn to get out of there. So he didn't go as fast as he would have needed to in order to kill people. So he had 9 injuries. He drove off campus, and then he had to decide, am I going to give myself up, make a run for it, or go and engage in some other act of violence? And he decides to give himself up. He pulls over in a neighborhood and pulls out his cell phone. The car is still running, and he calls 911. We have the recording of that call. And he says, hi, I've just run over a bunch of people on the campus here at Chapel Hill. And the emergency person on the phone, the 911 responder, says, what? And keeps him on the phone, asks him to spell his last name many times until he's really frustrated with the guy. He's clearly keeping him on the phone. He's been trained to. This is great emergency work until the police arrive. He turns himself in, and he is thrilled to have engaged in this act. And you can see him smiling in the photos of his being booked. Here's somebody who radicalized by himself here on our campus, in our small town, enough to want to kill people. We know all of this in even what German pop dance tune he was playing on his stereo while he was engaged in this act, because he wrote hundreds of pages of letters from jail to the local student newspaper that they were willing to share with me. And we have a very inside view, inside his head, picture of how somebody radicalizes to the extent that people become just pawns in whatever his political project was. If you think now of all the slightly off people who might go down a path of violence who are out there, driving a car on a sidewalk can be an act of terrorism if you call it that, if you want it to be that. And yet it does not happen very often. It is that easy. So as terrible as that act was, and as much as it shook us here in Chapel Hill, I think we can also have a second response after our shock and our dismay, which is like, oh, well, we are pretty fortunate that more people don't have that perspective, that more people aren't engaged in violence of that sort, that we are living generally in a peaceful society. And so folks who are out there saying Muslims are all potential terrorists, that they shouldn't be given religious freedoms to build houses of worship like other people, that they should be mistrusted, and unfortunately, according to surveys, there is a growing proportion of the American population that believes those hateful things. They just haven't really followed the news. Not the news of the attacks, but the news on the days when there are no attacks. The big picture here is that there really has not been nearly as much terrorism as we feared there would be. And that's good news.
Charles Kurzman is a professor of sociology here at the University of North Carolina. His most recent book is The Missing Martyrs: Why There Are So Few Muslim Terrorists. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
You're watching